Thank you all for coming. Like most authors who sell less than John Grisham, I had hoped that more people would come. But I think in this case it might be my fault. I think it might be that word of my intention leaked out, because my intention is to begin this evening by reading to you what is, in my opinion, one of the more mundane, more predictable, and less insightful paragraphs in this entire book. So I guess I ask for a few empty seats. Here is the paragraph. Most journalists behave like most other people in most other occupations. They do their jobs well, or better than well. They realize that others depend on them and are stimulated by the need to meet their responsibilities. They want to succeed and be rewarded for their success by gratitude, money, and maybe a few plaques at a few dinners in their honor. End of paragraph. This book is not about those people. This book is about people whose journalistic behavior was aberrant, not typical. In this book, Jayson Blair, who makes only a cameo appearance, is a wrongdoer of modest proportions. Now, you remember Jayson Blair. He was the young man who worked for the New York Times, who covered stories without actually going to them. What he would do was get newspapers from the areas in which the stories appeared, or sign on to the internet and get blogs and other accounts. And from the stories that appeared elsewhere of the event he was to cover, he cobbled together stories of his own, meaning that although the editors of the New York Times would have despised him, the accountants would have loved him. He was a cheap hire. He never filed an expense account for airfare, train fare, hotel bills, meals. He couldn't. He never went anywhere. Long before Jayson Blair started reporting on stories without benefit of actually witnessing them, one of the most esteemed figures in the history of American literature, or rather English literature, did the same thing, and he did it much more often. In the early 1740s, the distinguished, the eminent, the absent Dr. Samuel Johnson covered the debates of Britain's Parliament for a publication called Gentleman's Magazine. He covered the debates for more than 2 years. He showed up at Parliament once. One appearance in a little more than 2 years. Now, sometimes what he would do is hire a young man as a runner, which they call them in journalism today, and he would go over to the House of Commons and listen in for a few minutes, and then he would run back and tell Dr. Johnson what had been said, give him a general idea of a small portion of the debate. But essentially, Samuel Johnson just made the stuff up himself. He knew from other publications what topics were scheduled that day in Parliament, what topics were scheduled to be discussed. He knew who was scheduled to speak, and he knew the positions that these people had. So with that information as his source of raw materials, he just wrote the stuff himself. Now, why didn't members of Parliament complain? Because their speeches were so much more interesting coming from Johnson's pen than coming from their own mouths. History didn't find out the truth about Johnson's fraud until he admitted it himself, which he did because he finally got to the point at which he just couldn't stand it anymore. All those, in his opinion, semi-literate members of Parliament getting so much credit for a degree of eloquence that Samuel Johnson knew only Samuel Johnson could achieve. Johnson once said in defense of his absentee journalism that he did not think he was, quote, imposing on the world, end of quote. 6 days before he died, however, he changed his mind and on his deathbed apologized for this kind of reporting, rued his duplicity. He went to his grave having been responsible for what was, and I quote here from the book, the longest series of falsehoods ever assembled under the banner of fact in the history of reporting. A couple of decades later, the American Samuel Adams wrote a shorter but more insidious series of falsehoods in the Boston Gazette. His purpose was to incite his fellow Americans to separate themselves from British rule, legislatively, if possible, if not, then militarily. So, among other things, Johnson wrote about violence perpetrated by British soldiers who were stationed in Boston against American citizens. He wrote about, and just as important, inspired other publications to write about severely punitive laws that Parliament was intending to inflict on Americans. Lies, all of it, lies. It's a subject about which I wrote at length in a previous book that Carolyn mentioned called Infamous Scribblers, the Founding Fathers and the Rowdy Beginnings of American Journalism. So I didn't write about it at length in All the News Unfit to Print and won't speak about it at length here. Suffice it to say that as a newsman, Sam Adams was the biggest liar in the noblest cause in American history. Mark Twain was one of the great writers of fiction in American history. Unfortunately for the readers of a Nevada newspaper about a century and a half ago, he wrote some of that fiction in the guise of journalism. For instance, he described the discovery of a petrified man in the Nevada desert. He wrote as follows. The body was in a sitting position. The attitude was pensive, the right thumb resting against the side of the nose. Well, no, it wasn't. There wasn't any petrified man in the Nevada desert a century and a half ago, at least not as far as anybody knows. Twain also wrote stories about Indians being smothered to death and about a mining speculator. Twain hated the notion of financial speculation. About a mining speculator being murdered, quote, his throat cut from ear to ear and bearing in his hand a reeking scalp from which the warm, smoking blood was still dripping. Didn't happen. But despite all this, and more stories equally fictitious, Twain was unrepentant. He thought readers wanted, and occasionally deserved, a respite from the tedium, from the demands of reality. And he thought that reporters like him who provided this respite were to be commended, not censured. Here's a quote from Twain about that. The wise thing is for us to train ourselves to lie thoughtfully, judiciously, to lie firmly, frankly, squarely, with head erect, not haltingly, tortuously, with pusillanimous mien, as being ashamed of our high calling. It should go without saying that lying has never been generally thought of as a high calling in the field of journalism. Certainly, it was not a high calling as practiced by William Randolph Hearst in the days leading up to the Spanish-American War. In fact, to some extent, Hearst himself and his paper was responsible for the outbreak of the war in the first place. In 1898, Hearst's New York Journal published one incendiary article after another urging the United States to intervene in Cuba, where the Spaniards, who controlled the island, were treating the Cubans viciously. They were imposing high taxes on the Cubans. They were restricting the freedoms of the Cubans. They were inflicting severe punishments on the Cubans for the most minor of offenses. Eventually, the United States government got so upset about the situation that it sent the battleship Maine into Havana Harbor, not to do anything, just to sit there as a calming or perhaps intimidating presence. But on February 15th, 1898, the Maine exploded. All 250 people on board were killed. The New York Journal insisted in big black headlines and on the basis of no evidence whatsoever that Spain had been responsible. The United States had to go to war now. It absolutely had to. But what if the Spaniards hadn't been responsible for the destruction of the Maine? President William McKinley wasn't sure, and so what he did was convene a naval court of inquiry to look into the matter, which made Hearst livid.